Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I am super excited about this panel. We'll be talking about the rise of monopsony power in the labor market, which has been something I've been thinking about and talking about for about 10 years now, and finally there are lots of other people talking about it too, so that's always a good feeling. But just to sort of set the stage a little bit, monopsony is a framework in labor economics that was developed in 1933 by Joan Robinson in her book, The Economics of Imperfect Competition, where she described the ways in which individual employers can set wages at exploitative levels since they don't have to compete for workers with other employers. The most classic example would be a very concentrated labor market, like a geographically remote mining town where workers just don't have any other outside options. We also heard today from Mary Kay Henry. There are other examples like UPMC in Pittsburgh being a huge hospital system that ends up suppressing wages for a lot of healthcare workers because they just don't have other places to go work. But monopsony also, as Robinson initially described in 1933, is really any situation where workers have fewer outside options. It could be for reasons other than concentrated markets, and there's a variety of different causes that can cause monopsony. And likewise, there's a suite of policies that can make the labor market more dynamic and empower workers to share in the gains of economic growth. So this panel will dig deeper into what monopsony is and how this helps us understand solutions that can lead to broadly shared wage growth. And so to discuss this, we have Professor Dube and Professor Hertel-Fernandez. Dube is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's also a research fellow at the Institute for Labor Economics and the National Bureau of Economic Research. He was previously a visiting associate professor at MIT Department of Economics and at BU's Questrom School of Business. His research focuses on labor economics along with health economics, public finance, political economy. He's also a member of Equitable Growth Research Advisory Board. And Hertel-Fernandez is an assistant professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. His current research focuses on the politics of labor unions with a focus on public sector labor movement and worker preferences for new models of labor organization. And his latest book was State Capture: How Conservative Activists, Big Businesses, and Wealthy Donors Reshaped the American States and the Nation, which was just published this past summer. So to start off, let's dig a little bit more into what monopsony actually is. So for Aaron, what are the different factors behind monopsony? How do we measure it? And then for sort of not regular people, everyone's a regular person, for people to think about what that actually means sort of in terms of their own wallets and dollars and cents.
Yeah, so again, thanks for having me here. It's great to participate in this conversation. Like you, I was also pleased over the last few years, especially to see the blossoming of interest and research on this topic, on the question of employer-side market power. And that's really what monopsony is. It sounds like a fancy word, but really it just means employers have some degree of choice in whether to pay a higher wage or a lower wage, that the wage setting for a type of work is not just set by impersonal market forces alone, that wage policies that employers pursue actually play an important role in determining who gets paid what. And so at a basic level, it means employers have some degree of wage setting power. I could pay a bit of a higher wage and have easier time recruiting and retaining workers, or I could pay a lower wage and have a harder time and have higher turnover and more vacancies. When you face this trade-off, employers will generally pay a wage that will not be quite as high as would be the case under a fully competitive scenario. So that's kind of the basic of what this market power means. The question is, why is there this market power? So, Kate, you mentioned concentration. So I think the oldest form of example is simply that maybe there's only a couple of employers who actually hire people for the kind of work that I do, so there's just not that many options. And the classic example is the company town, right? But the evidence in the last few years suggests that it's not just company town, that concentration actually does seem to depress wages in a variety of contexts, more so than maybe people had realized. New work coming out shows, with very careful research, when firms merge and that leads to a reduction, or rather an increase in concentration in the local labor market that is associated with wage reductions for both directly hired workers, but also other workers in that labor market. And so concentration is an important aspect of monopsony power. However, it's not the only one. And I would say it's probably not even the most important source of monopsony power in modern US labor market. Another basic reason why employers have some degree of wage setting power is because it's costly for workers to pick up and move. It's costly to search, it's to spend time, find out information, and there's also a lot of, sort of affective and emotional aspect of just quitting a job and taking a new one. All of those, basically in sort of econ speak would be considered search frictions. That again gives employers a degree of market power. And finally, people may value the same job somewhat differently. So jobs are differentiated. Maybe I like my commute a little more, or a little not as, I don't think it's as bad as you do. Maybe you like our coworkers better than I do. That makes the job somewhat not exactly the same value to different people. That differentiation is yet another reason why employers have some degree of market power. So all of that together then means that when it comes to the labor market, employers have some degree of wage setting power. How large is it? Well, again, this is a very exciting area of research right now, and there's pretty much every week I see some new paper on the topic, which is again very exciting. I think sort of if I had to summarize the state of play in the literature, I would sort of say that on average in the US labor market, the degree of monopsony power means that employers probably pay something like 15 to 20 cents on the dollar lower than what might be the case in a hypothetical, fully competitive labor market. But of course, there's a lot of variation. And again, this is something that I think we'll see more work on.
Yeah, it's great to see all the work coming out. But sort of why are people all of a sudden paying a lot more attention to monopsony now? Why has it increased over time? Is that why people are paying more attention?
So this is again a really good question. So there's I think some set of research really looked to try to document whether concentration, for example, has risen. And here I think it's important to be careful. I do not think the evidence to date strongly suggests an increase in monopsony power in the way that I laid out. Certainly, concentration at the local labor market doesn't seem to have increased. It may have even actually fallen some, but in complicated ways. Large chains like Walmart and Target have come in to a lot of local labor markets. That has actually led to less concentration of the local labor market, but at the national level where wages may be set, there's actually somewhat higher concentration. So I think there are more subtle things going on there. But what I think is more important potentially to understand where monopsony fits in terms of income inequality and wage stagnation is that when it comes to wage setting, monopsony or labor supply really facing a firm is only one of various other factors that could affect wages. In general, I think historically there have been other constraints on employers, fairness norms, unions in particular, higher minimum wages. All of these countervailing forces actually reduce the ability of employers to fully exercise their monopsony power. So what I think has happened is a lot of these other constraints have become weaker over time, leading to employers actually being bound, a lot more employers being bound by simply sort of the monopsony aspect alone, as opposed to other sources of workers' bargaining power, which have actually fallen.
Yeah, that was another part, I think, of Mary Kay Henry's remarks, where she talked about countervailing market power. It was really great to hear sort of a labor leader talk about a technical term like that, but I do think it is quite important. So Alex, to you, if declining worker power explains why the negative consequences of monopsony have increased, why is that happening?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kate, and thanks so much to Equitable Growth for inviting me to this discussion. I saw this was billed as a fireside chat, which makes me excited as an FDR nerd. I think it's also relevant Because FDR understood that public policy is a tool for building both economic and political power. And that's a key part of the worker power story. Because in mid-century, employers realized that they could use public policy to entrench their economic positions. And so while monopsony power may not have changed since mid-century, since the New Deal, employer political power has, and it has shifted in ways that has changed the distribution of economic power in the workplace. And the story of declining worker power is not just one of automatic changes in the economy. Employers have worked in new domains and invested in old domains to change policies in ways that disadvantage workers. So what are some examples of those? Well, some of it has involved new policy that cuts back the workers' rights. And Mary Kay Henry mentioned Taft-Hartley, for instance, that was passed after the New Deal era, created our system of private sector bargaining, and it substantially made it harder to organize new work sites. Another site is the judiciary. Court decisions pushed on by employers played a very important role in curbing what unions could bargain over in the workplace and making it harder for them to organize new shops. And then a third aspect has been what I would call malign neglect of labor law at the hand of employers. As the economy has changed in ways that make it harder for workers to organize and that make our firm-based, establishment-based model of bargaining and organizing so much more difficult, employers have ensured that labor law has not changed. We have not updated that since the 1940s. And so in all of those ways, I think employers have stacked the policy deck in ways that disadvantage workers.
So I'm just going to ask you to go a little bit deeper into that too, on the role of enforcement of existing laws. So I don't think a piece of that is perhaps employers being able to disregard it, but the other side of that coin is lack of enforcement on the part of federal agencies or state agencies. So what is the role of enforcement of existing laws versus what is the need for new provisions?
Yeah, the existing labor laws that we have on the books are sadly often not enforced at all, even though that they have remained stagnant over time. And I think there's no better case of this than the minimum wage, where we know that broad swaths of low-wage workers experience wage theft. And recent research by the Economic Policy Institute suggests that in some of the largest states in the country, something like 16 or 17% of low-wage workers aren't paid the minimum wage, resulting in billions of dollars in wages that are being withheld and retained by their employers. And so we need greater enforcement, even just of the laws that are on the books.
Yeah, so one reason I'm also very excited to have this panel with both of you is because you both do great empirical work, but you also do a lot of sort of policy analysis work, which is I think why it's so perfect for this. So you both have written a lot on new policies or modifications to policies that would help offset the decline of institutions that have historically reduced monopsony power. So let's get into some of the details of the proposals you've both worked on and talk about how the different policies perhaps work together in tandem. So Aaron, I know that you've done a lot of work on wage boards. Can you explain what they are, where they exist now, what we know from examples?
Sure. Let me start with a little bit of a bigger picture about what wage standards do in a world where the labor market has substantial monopsony power. So, of course, we can set wage standards in any market. It could be a highly competitive market. It could be a market with monopsony power. But the point is that the extent to which there is a lot of monopsony power, setting those standards are actually relatively harmless in terms of overall efficiency, and in fact helps market work better and not worse. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. So I think that's, in general, we want to have a lot of arrows in our policy quiver, as it were, when it comes to battling inequality. And I think the simplest place to start is the minimum wage. And here, I think, we have a lot of evidence, of course, on this question. I think the overall weight of evidence suggests that minimum wages work pretty well in the US, raising wages at the bottom without any sort of substantial changes, reductions in employment. And that's exactly what you'd expect in a market which is characterized by some employer-side power, monopsony power. And so that's great, but there's only so far you can take the minimum wage to help raise wages, especially in the middle of the distribution. Even proposed increases of the federal minimum wage, like in Raise Wage Act, is not going to really reach to the middle or the median worker very much. So an alternative or rather not an alternative to the minimum wage, but rather an addition to the minimum wage, one can impose sectoral standards, right? And so you can have standards for different types of jobs, by sector, by occupation, that have, think like hundreds of minimum wages, not just the single federal or even state ones, but additional wage standards throughout the distribution. This is actually not something that's sort of like a idea that I just came up with or someone just came up with. It happens in some form or rather in most developed economies. Oftentimes, for example, in Switzerland or France, it happens through the extension of collective bargaining agreements, where there's lots of standards, and then that's imposed. We heard about this, for example, from Mary Kay Henry earlier, that those are actually then imposed on everyone, right? Those are that all employers, including employers who may not have any unionized workers. So that's one way of setting standard. Another way of setting such standards comes from Australia, where it's done more statutorily, where actually more judicially. There's sort of a board that actually sets these standards by different occupation and industry, and I think that's a very appealing model to consider in the U.S. So I've done some work, looking at sort of simulations of what would happen if we had such standards by, sector, by occupation, by region, and even having something sort of a moderate standard, like making sure each of those types of jobs, if you move the minimum to something like 1/3 of the current wage, like around 35th percentile, for example, you can substantially raise wages in the middle of the distribution, 10 to 20% easily. So that's a much farther reach than, for example, a federal or state minimum wages would have. So I think that's a complementary way of dealing with some of the employer side market power.
Yeah, that's great. And Alex, how might other policies or changes in worker organization build on or reinforce the pro-worker effects of wage boards that Aaron described?
I've been really excited to see the surge of new ideas around labor law reform or changes to worker organizations. And I think that one of the exciting aspects of wage boards is not just their ability to boost the wage floor and reach a greater number of people and change the distribution relative to the minimum wage. It also has the potential to build up new forms of worker organization or buttress existing labor organizations like unions. Because in order to have the wage board, in many settings, you have a labor representative sitting at the table weighing in on what these standards should be. In places where there isn't a union, you could imagine the board providing resources to a new organization to form and represent workers, or you could even imagine building in existing organizations into the enforcement of the standards that get set by the wage board. As I mentioned earlier, we know that so many labor standards aren't enforced across the economy, particularly at the low end. So you could imagine providing grants or resources to labor organizations to make sure that whatever wages and benefit standards are set by the board actually bind across workplaces. And more generally, I think an exciting aspect of wage boards is that it might encourage unions to think more broadly about the benefits and services that they provide to workers by taking wages and benefits out of competition. So in other work where I've surveyed large numbers of workers to understand what aspects of a labor organization would you be most excited about? Wages emerge certainly as an important aspect, but even more so are benefits and services like unemployment benefits or portable health insurance and retirement plans. And you can imagine unions doing more of that if wage boards were setting wage and benefit standards for workers.
And Alex, you had sort of alluded to the fact that there's a lot of energy right now around labor law reform. I think it's been really exciting to see so many presidential campaign platforms around big changes to how labor law is done, and a lot of those have included things like sectoral bargaining. So that is being put together as the idea of big sectors of the economy can be under one collective bargaining agreement. But that is a big leap from wage boards. So how do you get to the point where we have the union density that could sustain something like a sectoral bargaining or support sectoral bargaining? So Aaron, I know you've written on this a little bit. How do we move from one model to the other?
Yeah, so I think at the broadest level, if we're really serious about raising wages in the middle, you need some type of sectoral standards. I don't think you can really get a conversation started about serious increases in middle wages without that type of a institutional reform. So then the question becomes, what's the best way of actually structuring that? I think in the longer run, the best way to structure that is by having sectoral bargaining and extension of collective bargaining contracts like we have in many high-performing developed economies. In the medium run, however, we have to confront the reality that in the United States, private sector union density is very low, and in some parts of the country, virtually non-existing in certain sectors. So if you want to have a plan that in the medium run actually reaches a lot of workers in America, you need a way to actually have those standards in place even when there isn't sufficient density that would sort of be above a threshold needed to trigger collective bargaining. So, in my proposal, I would start with a default of having sectoral standards using, for example, wage boards. But then when the union membership density crosses certain threshold, it would automatically trigger collective bargaining, which can supersede whatever the wage board might actually have to say. And that allows a couple of things that I think are useful. One, it gets some wage standard throughout the distribution, even in sort of like the near future. We want to make organizing easier, but starting from such a low level of density, it's going to take some time to get anywhere that's high enough. At the same time, it also leaves a very important role for unions and additional organizing to play to build standards. Because in the longer run, without having a strong enough labor movement, really, I think all of these other policy reforms are unlikely to be sustainable.
Yeah, I just want to give the audience a quick reminder to submit questions on Slido. We'll head to questions from the audience in just a minute, but before we do that, what you said I think fits really nicely with Alex's research on sort of the political dimensions that might pave the way for workers to support these sort of broad-based policies. Can you elaborate on your research?
Yeah, so I mentioned that I've been doing research on the public to understand how people think about unions and worker organizations and the sort of features of new organizations that they would be most enthusiastic about, most willing to join organizations, most willing to contribute financially to those organizations. And collective bargaining emerges as one of the most important things that workers want from new labor organizations or existing ones. But similarly important, as I mentioned, were benefits and services. So I think this is a big opportunity for labor organizations, both unions and other organizations, to attract new workers and new energy. The other thing that comes out of my research that I think is relevant for thinking about getting to more expansive labor organizing and more expansive labor law is the fact that most people don't have a personal connection to a union right now. And so that means how they think about unions is heavily conditioned by what they read in the newspaper, what they hear from politicians. And it's really only through firsthand contact with either unions or collective action like strikes that people really find out what unions are all about. And I'll give you one concrete example. I've been studying the teacher strikes that unfolded over 6 states last year. And one of the striking things, no pun intended, about those results was that it was the parents who were most exposed to the strikes. They had children in the schools, they were talking to the striking teachers, were most likely to change their opinion and become more favorable towards the strikes, and also more interested in labor action themselves. And so it really shows that in order to build interest in the labor movement, labor needs to get out there and engage in more grassroots collective action so that people know what the possibilities are from a revived labor movement.
Great. And just one last question from me for Alex. I also think it's really important for us to make sure we're thinking about racial equity, gender equity, ethnic equity, since that still tends to be one of the most persistent indicators of what people's labor market outcomes are. And so how can we think about preferences for unions, people's access to unions, how unions serve different groups of people based on their race and ethnic background?
So thinking about the preferences that workers have for union representation, labor representation, in survey after survey, it's clear that minority workers, in particular African Americans, have a large unmet demand for labor representation. So to give you one concrete example, in surveys that ask non-union members, would you vote to join a union, non-white workers are about 50% more likely than white workers to want union representation, and African Americans are about 70% more likely to say they want a union compared to white workers. Similarly, you see non-white workers, and especially black workers, saying that they think unions could help their conditions on the job. And so when we think about this unmet demand for labor representation that Mary Kay Henry alluded to, that's disproportionately for people of color.
Great. So a question from the audience, which I think also helps us think through how to move from what we have now to this dream world of sectoral bargaining with agreements covering every single person. What can states or local governments do to sort of start to push the needle forward on these big structural policies?
Great question. The short answer is a lot. And in fact, a little known fact is that 5 states, including California, New York, New Jersey, Colorado, they have already in place laws that would allow to actually have wage boards. And California and New York especially have used it. For example, New York used sort of the wage board model to actually institute the fast food minimum wage. California used it in the mid-90s to raise the overall minimum wage when it was difficult to do legislatively. However, there's been very little to use it more expansively to try to reach a larger set of workers. This could happen now. This could, a state like California in particular could easily lead the way, constituting wage boards in major sectors, including in healthcare or fast food, and really start raising the wage in the bottom half of the distribution, especially towards the middle. And this is, look, states are the laboratories, as we say, and it's true. We want to try these things out, and states can really take a role in doing that. It's much harder on labor law because, except for groups of workers who are not covered by the National Labor Relations Act, it's hard for states to do anything about that under current legal structure. However, that's not true when it comes to something like the wage board. And this is why I think it's very exciting to consider state taking actions even while there's sort of difficult to do at the federal level.
Yeah, and Alex, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would second the wage board idea, and I'd also say that states and localities can take action to partner with labor organizations on training programs, on benefit provision, or benefit navigation. I think there are a lot more possibilities for thinking about these sort of highly valued services and benefits that might attract people to worker groups. But just to echo what Erin just said, it's very perverse that our national labor law only allows states to pass laws that hurt unions rather than building them up through right-to-work laws. I think let's take a step back and acknowledge how much that reflects the tilted political playing field in our country.
And I'll just do one last question. And the question here is, monopsony power is perhaps especially present in rural areas, given few employers, or one could argue that there are few employers, or other sort of search frictions that people may face in rural areas. Have you, or are you familiar with any other research that has investigated this phenomenon specifically in rural areas? And is there a way of looking at forces of the economy that could unify rural and low-wage urban workers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when it comes to concentration, it's definitely true that the highest concentration are more rural, thinner labor markets. And there's evidence that when, for example, the example I gave earlier with mergers, when the mergers actually increase concentration, that's a lot more likely to happen in thinner, more rural markets. Wages fall by around 2%, including for other workers even more so. At the same time, in work that we're doing currently, I'm doing with Suresh Naidu and others, we find that the overall extent of monopsony or wage-setting power is not that different even in very dense urban labor markets. And that's because of all the other reasons, the search frictions, the job differentiation. All of that leads to a case where even in urban, thick labor markets, employers have a good degree of monopsony power.
Yeah, and for the second part, Alex, do you see this as potentially being a way to unify workers across different geographic spaces?
Yeah, to the extent that unions are able to move past the establishment-based model of organizing and bargaining, I think it could be a really exciting opportunity for people to have a setting in which they interact with and feel common cause with people from very different walks of life as themselves. And as Elizabeth Cohen alluded to, this was a key part of the CIO at the time of the New Deal, and I think it could be, again, with a revived